Good evening. On behalf of our editor, Dr. John Thomas III, and the Christian Recorder, as well as members of the AME Church, we are honored today and very grateful to have our author, Miss Alecia Johnson, to come before us. She is the author of our book, Flip the Tables, The Everyday Disruptive Guide to Courage and Making Change. Welcome. Thank you for being with us today, Ms. Johnson.
Thank you for having me. Honored to be here.
Awesome. Alecia, could you please tell us a little bit about the book? Why is it important for us to flip the proverbial tables in our lives?
I grew up in the church. My dad is a pastor. And so all the stories of Jesus I grew up with, and the story of Jesus flipping over tables in the temple has always been something I had been drawn to, probably because I've been a little disruptive my entire life. But it was always something that piqued my curiosity, right? About what got Jesus to the point that he would flip over these tables, what made him so angry, what made him so crunk that he went to the temple and flipped over those tables. And so if I think back into April 2020, we're in the middle of the pandemic. We are in the middle of a crazy election cycle, although 2024 was even crazier. But then we didn't think it was going to get any crazier. And for myself, I was in between campaigns. I had just finished working on Senator Elizabeth Warren's presidential campaign. And I hadn't yet decided to go work on President Biden's campaign, which I eventually did and was a senior advisor. But this election's happening. The pandemic is happening. George Floyd has been murdered, and we're seeing the racial justice uprising. And so there's so many things happening in society. And as someone who has been in political organizing my entire career, several campaigns, working at Planned Parenthood, worked with President Obama, the list goes on, I constantly get the question of how can I have impact in the world? And I started to ask that question, what would get us to the place that we would flip over the proverbial tables in the world around us? How could we all be disruptors? And then God really was very clear with me. This is all connected to you getting rooted in your purpose and you becoming the person that I have destined you to be. And so I had all these accolades. I'm thinking about all these big ideas. Companies and organizations are calling me for solutions. And yet I'll be very honest with you, Star. I was stuck. I was unhappy. I was in a place of, now I know, a place that needed transformation. But that transformation was the key to me becoming exactly who God called me to be, which was somebody who, pushed against the status quo, right? I was on this linear path of what my career should look like, but I actually wanted to do other things in life. And I also wanted to tend to my personal life in ways that I had sacrificed so long for my career. As I'm thinking of all these things, as the world is navigating all these other things, I connect the dots that, oh my goodness, in order for us to flip over these proverbial tables in our communities and disrupt communities for good, we first have to disrupt ourselves. And that is what led me to writing this book. All those things came to me before I realized that I was going to write a book. And the book is actually the journey that I had to go on in order to get to this place of understanding that our gifts are actually to advance society and that we are supposed to use our feelings, as Jesus did, as motivation for us to push forward. And so that's where it came from. And it took 5 years to birth, but here we are.
Awesome. So in speaking on the scripture that you just stated, with Jesus overturning the tables, why did you find it so important to connect that account to this book?
I am a person of deep faith. And even though I work in politics, right, and I work on some issues that, quite frankly, I think our society has made controversial, even though I don't think they should be, I've never minimized being a person of faith. And to be honest, it is because of how I understand the text and Jesus. And I say this all the time, if people read the Bible and the red text, I think the world will look a lot differently when it comes to our policies and our politics. But I digress with that piece. I have been in spaces constantly where I didn't minimize my faith. If anything, I led with my faith in order for folks to understand why I advocate for the things that I advocate for. And I also believe it's a bit disruptive for folks who know me for one thing, and then they hear that, oh goodness, she actually is a person of deep faith. And I think all these things can coexist. And so it was really important for me to talk about, to navigate the book through the lens a bit of my faith. And I tell people all the time, it's actually doesn't have to be, you don't have to be a Christian to get the concepts of the book. I have friends who are not people of faith who love the book and who see Flip the Tables as a reference to Real Housewives, which I also love. But when I think about what I want this book to do, I think about how disruptive that story in particular is. It makes you stop and think and gives you pause. And that is actually the lens in which I want people to have with this book. It makes them stop and have pause and really sit with what got us to this point. And again, I wouldn't be who I am without my faith. And navigating experiences around mental health. I talk about being diagnosed with OCD when I was 15 years old and in and out of therapy majority of my life. Yes, that can happen while also I'm a person of faith, right? Like I need to disrupt this notion that people of faith actually should not engage with mental health care, right? I work for reproductive rights. Those things can coexist. The things that I do that I didn't realize were disrupting people's thought process of what a Christian could do or should do or how they operate. That was just my daily existence. And so for me to lay it out was extremely important. And then lastly, I'll say there's a chapter in the book about speaking life into your dreams. Some people call it manifestations. I just know the scripture, life and death is in the power of the tongue. And that is actually what has led me to so many places in my career. I can't talk about who I am, what I have done, without actually talking about how God has done it in my life, right? And I give him all the glory. And so, of course, my book has to really speak to that core of who I am.
So your book is broken down: disruption of self, disruption of vision, and disruption of community. You mentioned how faith and therapy were so important to you. How do you say it works together to foster an individual's healing, resilience, and growth? And how does spiritual grounding influence the way you approach justice and advocacy?
I love that question because it makes me think of the Alice Walker quote that got me out of bed 2 days after the 2024 election when, unfortunately, Vice President Harris lost. And I actually had worked on her campaign as a senior advisor. And I'm paraphrasing it. It is in the book. And she says, basically, you have to keep a healthy soul in the face of constant oppression. And in order for me to keep a healthy soul, that is my relationship with Jesus. That is my daily faith practice. And to be honest, when I'm feeling overwhelmed and anxious, I feel like I know to be true that I have actually moved further away from God. And I have put some of my daily practices on the back burner because I'll say, oh, I don't have time, or I've woken up late, or whatever it may be. So that grounding is extremely important for myself. And there's even research that shows people with a spiritual grounding tend to navigate the world a bit better, are able to confront some of, society's biggest challenges, whether personal or within the world around us, a little bit better because we are anchored. And disruption of self was really peeling back, how do I keep my soul anchored? And I do talk about mental health there as well as and disruption of vision when I had a nervous breakdown in college because I was putting so much pressure on myself. And I talk a little bit about in the book, and it's interesting, my parents and I talk about this too. And, there's that Black Christians love to say we have to be a living sacrifice. And I had to really sit with what that really meant. And I said, I don't think that meant for us to, put our health and our bodies in positions to not survive because of our ministry. But I do think we understand that our lives are in service. Absolutely. And there are going to be sacrifices that we have to make. But looking at Jesus's life, he went to the mountain to actually rest. And I remember this devotional, and I talk about this in the book too, this devotional I was reading one time about rest. And again, I'm paraphrasing, but the author of the devotional said, if God created the world in 6 days and then rested on the seventh day, who are you to think that you are bigger than God or more important than God, that you don't need rest. And when I tell you that hit me like a ton of bricks, I literally said, oh, okay. I have to reestablish my relationship with rest. And we have to pay attention to where in the text and in life, when it tells us that there is a time and a place for rest and that restoration, and that is really important. I also think about throughout the Bible and scripture, there's so many times you have people just talking to God, right? And to be honest, I think that is kind of a form of therapy. I am so grateful that when I was diagnosed with OCD, my parents were very much like, yes, we're going to pray. And also, we know that God has given these other people this expertise to help you through that. And so it is so important for us to do the things that we need to restore our soul, because quite frankly, as I think about what's happening, in order for us to face what is literally happening around us, we can't be wounded soldiers limping through this battle. We have to be as strong and courageous as possible in order to face this evil that we have never, a lot of us have never seen in our lifetimes. And I'm very intentional about saying a lot of us haven't seen in our lifetimes, because our elders have seen some of this in their lifetimes. And what I also understand is that our elders, as I look back at our elders and our ancestors for the solutions to get through these moments, I see that they were grounded in their faith. They figured out how to rest and also find joy and all of that. And that is what I am trying to model and want all of us to model as you navigate through the book.
Can you speak concerning the importance of self-awareness being a foundational step before becoming an effective disruptor for the community?
Well, listen, I have a whole chapter that's called "The Red Flag Is You," because I think so often we are quick to identify the harm that other people have caused in our lives, whether interpersonally or a system, right? And those things do happen. And yet at the same time, and I talk about this in the book, I was assessing some relationships, romantic and as well as friendships, and even some job situations. And while, yes, I had been hurt in those scenarios, I looked at how I was contributing to my own pain. I looked at how I also would jump to conclusions, or while it wasn't my intention, the impact was that I still hurt my brother or my sister. And it is so important for us to be self-aware, to understand where we are holding ourselves back, whether it's our lack of faith or lack of courage, or, self-sabotaging beliefs, or even, there's this conversation that's been happening in society about boundaries, having all these boundaries with people. But I think people have, and myself included, have actually turn that into actually having walls and not letting people in and not building that deep connection and not understanding that, I might be a little bit inconvenienced, but that's actually what makes up a relationship. And the other piece that I had to grapple with, and something that, is really important for us to be self-aware about, and especially as I think about the fact that I wrote kind of like a self-help book, we often look at ourselves as problems to be fixed instead of these uniquely designed human beings to embrace. And if we can't give ourselves the grace that we are fighting for other people to give us, then how can they give us the grace that we believe that we deserve, right? And so having that self-awareness is incredibly important. And then also acknowledging how our behavior will impact other people. And I like to remind folks that people talk about good intentions, or they take action based on an intention. And yet at the end of the day, regardless of that intention, if the impact is harm, then you actually have to atone for that. And how can we build relationship with one another, to lock arms with one another, if we can't even say, I'm sorry, if we can't say, hey, I actually don't understand this. Can you help me understand? Right. And so that self-awareness is incredibly important. And it is a thread throughout the entire book, even the disruption of community, when I talk about exploring and opening our mind to other experiences and cultures that we may not, experience or engage with every single day, is incredibly important for us to be curious and to be open. But most importantly, that atonement to continue to deepen relationship with self and one another is why self-awareness is so important for this work.
The church is a community, and how can the church act as a disruptor? How has it acted as a disruptor in the past, and how can we move forward in the present to help the community and in the broader cultural context as well? How do you envision the church as being a disruptor for the community?
I think the church, specifically the Black church, has an incredible responsibility right now. I mean, to be honest, when people ask me what shaped my political ideology, it was the Black church. It is the Black church, right? Because so many of the things that have become political positions in politics, they're just actually based on humanity and a framework that I understood in the church. And so it is important for the church to understand that role, and not only building community, but also standing up against oppression. I live in Northern Virginia. I go to Alfred Street Baptist Church. I'm so grateful to Reverend Dr. Howard John Wesley. And I also spend a lot of time at Kingdom Fellowship with Pastor Watley. And both of them spend a lot of time talking about the responsibility to make sure we as a congregation are not only building community, but that we are taking care of ourselves in these very dark times that we are about to walk into. And at the same time, talking about what is happening in the world through the lens of, racial justice, and making sure that women aren't treated a certain way. And it is so critical that they are doing that work. It is so critical that is going beyond just making sure people go and vote. It is making sure that the church is building interventions for people that, again, I live in the DMV area. People are losing their jobs because they're federal employees. And we know that the federal government employs a lot of Black people. A lot of Black wealth was attained when the federal government started employing our people. It is important for us to find those interventions, but it's also important for the church to uphold so many of the institutions that continue to educate us. It is important for the churches to be funding these HBCUs, to preserving our history, whether it's engaging with some of the museums that have our artifacts. It is teaching our history as they are gutting our schools from even being able to talk about the harms and the very real challenges and the very real violence of enslavement. And so the church, actually, the responsibility of the church right now is even more imperative than it was before, because quite frankly, this is where people are going to be able to understand what is happening, understand our history, but then also understand how we can get over. And so I'm just so grateful that there are so many leaders. And yes, I called out two that I spend a lot of time in. My dad does the same thing, Pastor Tommy Bailey, as well as so many other brilliant leaders and clergy who understand the responsibility, not just in this moment, but overall.
In speaking, going back to the conversation about our unsung heroes, you mentioned your grandmother quite a few times in the book, Mrs. O, and your story about her going fishing when your grandfather took the keys away from that was hilarious. But how can we see the importance of our unsung heroes in the civil rights movement, and the significant impact that these individuals have pushing forward the new paradigm?
Well, I'm so glad you love that story. I miss my late grandmother, Mrs. Ozella Bennett, so much. And her quote that she said to my grandfather when he wanted to stop her from going fishing, she said, "You might slow me down, but you can't stop me." And that is, I believe, honestly, who I am. And I didn't realize that was what a disruptor was. That's just how I was raised. And she was such a matriarch in our family. And the stories that she told me, I'm grateful that I started asking her a lot of questions before she passed in 2015. She was sharing with me what it was like to raise children in a segregated South in Southern Virginia, what it was like for her to get on a bus in Virginia and go down to hear Dr. King speak in Savannah, Georgia. We actually drove past the church that she went to see him speak. And that was when I really understood that, wow, it is these foot soldiers who their names are not in history books or the prominent history books that we read, right, in school and university. But it is because of these foot soldiers that the civil rights movement was what it was. And I talk about these unsung heroes because, as the title of the book says, the everyday disruptor's guide. So often people think that they have to quit their job and run for office or have millions of followers, or, folks are looking for the next Malcolm X or Dr. King. But the reality is, all of us rooted in our purpose, doing 2 to 3 small disruptive things every single day, that adds up and that fuels this bigger movement. I think about Senator Cory Booker, God bless him, for that 25-hour filibuster. He wasn't up there talking about himself. And yes, he is one of the best speakers we have seen in a lifetime. He was telling everyday stories of people, we don't know their names, but those people had the courage to share their story with his office or whatever it may be, in order for him to paint this picture for us. And had those people stayed quiet, we wouldn't have that picture. We wouldn't have those amazing 25 hours that actually broke a racist record and reclaimed it for us as Black folks. And so the Everyday Disruptors Guide is to remind us of the power that all of us have, whether or not our names are going to be in history books. And that is the fortitude that our ancestors had. I was just in Mobile, Alabama this weekend, and doing a couple of book events. And I'm so grateful to have been in community, but I was also able to spend time at the Heritage Museum around the Clotilda. And I was overcome with so much emotion. And yes, Zora Neale Hurston was able to capture some believe he is the last survivor of that voyage from that voyage from Africa over to Mobile. Others say that there was a woman who actually outlived him, but as history does, we don't, maintain the names of women in history. And as I think about him telling his story, I think about how important it was for him and his siblings and his family and the people that came over, for them to keep moving forward, and that I have to honor their legacy by continuing to do the work. And while we know his name, and there are so many people that we don't know their names, there's so many of our ancestors we don't know their names, and yet their spirit is within us. And that is what is actually helping us move forward. And so I want us to honor those names, those people who blood, sweat, and tears, their livelihoods, they put on the line. We have to do the same thing too. Had they given up because no one's going to know my name, none of us would be able to be sitting here and with some of the freedoms that we have right now, because they gave up so early, because no one knew their names. To be honest, I shared this at, I'm a Delta, and I was at Delta Days speaking to some of the collegians. And I was telling them how our founders, and a lot of our founders, as well as a lot of Deltas that have come before us, did the work, even though they knew what they were fighting for may not be realized in their lifetime. But they still continued to do the work because they understood that the promise eventually would come. And whether it would come in their lifetime or they were laying the groundwork for their descendants, it was imperative for them to keep going. And so that's why it's so important for me to talk about those unsung heroes, because I am literally in existence because of them.
So do you believe that the younger generation is able to be effective disruptors, or even better disruptors than the previous generation? And how can we learn from that wisdom of that previous generation to, complement the energy that's needed for the movement today?
I mean, we got to be honest with ourselves about how young so speaking of people whose names are in history books, we got to think about how young they were. John Lewis was a teenager when he crossed the bridge in Selma and his head was smashed, right? And so many of the images we've seen of, schools being integrated, those are kids being disruptive, right? And whether or not they chose to be, it was these young people who literally, their bodies were on the line. And as I talk to younger generations, it's very interesting because I'm kind of this bridge generation where I had a cell phone, but social media wasn't on my cell phone. It was connected to my college account.
Mhm.
And, there were a lot of parameters around social media. They're consuming so much information, and some of which tells them that change has to happen overnight, that has to be instant, right? And yet, young people are telling us that they are consuming information differently, that they actually do want change to happen extremely fast. And they are understanding the power of their voice. But I think that's been the thread through in history. I do talk about a lot of movements in the book started by young people. I studied abroad in China when I was in college, and I was really inspired by what happened at Tiananmen Square. These college students put themselves on the line and unfortunately ended in massacre, but yet that changed the trajectory of the Chinese government, right? And so I am encouraged by how frustrated young people are. I would like for them to be less distracted and really understand how much power they have. So often we concede our power before we even step forward, and they do have a lot of power. And if we look at what has been happening, I think about these mass shootings that have happened and sadly continue to happen, and these teenagers who organize around that. Some of them are running and winning office. Some of them are leading movements, right? And so I think young people, and actually let me say that differently. When we are talking to younger generations, we are so often talking to them from a place of our elders in the position that they are in right now versus who were our elders when they were 19, 20, and 21 and 22 years old, and giving them the courage and understanding that there's a roadmap here. Your work begins now. You are most powerful here now. And I'll be very honest, to waste your youth doing frivolous things versus when you have all this energy right now is the opposite of being a disruptor. I am so encouraged by the younger generation. I taught a class at Georgetown, and the way that they challenged me, a political organizing expert, but the way that they challenged me just really showed me that the future is the younger generation. And once they get it together, I think it's going to be a powerful society that has been shaped by young people who are not taking no for an answer, that believe in community, that are so much more inclusive than other generations, and are saying, quite frankly, the society we're living in right now is no longer working. Yes, let's burn it down, but not to rebuild it, but to build something better.
So you are a member of the 92%, and there is a intersect with race and politics and gender. How does the existence of the Black woman inherently challenge systems of power?
The question says it all, right? And I try to remind people that we think about Black bodies in this country. We were brought here for two reasons: to either labor or give birth to labor. And when enslavement became illegal, this nation, capitalism, said, oh, we don't have any need for Black bodies. And so that's why, you see, I would be honest, I would say that you see enslavement through new forms now, right? And you see the destroying of our bodies in new forms. That's why the Black maternal mortality rate is extremely high in the wealthiest nation in the world. I tell people all the time, and I say this in the book too, sometimes our presence in itself will hold people accountable. My very existence as a Black woman at the intersection is disruptive to a society that says I should not exist. And sometimes we don't even have to communicate that to disrupt the rooms that we are in, to disrupt the movement that we are working with. It is very interesting. This past weekend, there were all of these protests around the country, millions of people, which was beautiful to see. And yet the 92% was at brunch. We were with our family. We were with our friends. The 92% for the most part wasn't there, and it was felt. And that in itself was disruptive. People were looking around and said, oh my goodness, we got to figure out the solution. For us, we said, well, there was a solution in a Black woman, but you didn't want that. And so now you're going to feel what it looks like when Black women have decided to turn inward, take care of ourselves, take care of each other, and you've got to find the solution for the community. And so I I'm in a place now, and my mother says it's getting older and it's the wisdom, it's allowing for my presence to speak for itself, because a lot of the rooms that I've been in, I'm not supposed to be in. But who said that? Who created that society? Someone else. White supremacy created that society. And as that is burning down, I am excited for Black women, the 92%, and all of our rest, because we are going to be these strong soldiers that get to the other side, building something new that actually works for us.
So being a disruptor, it takes a lot of energy. And rest is a ministry. How can Black women have and know the importance of rest without diminishing their value as agents of change and courage?
I had to, in order for me to get to a place of radical rest and restoration, I had to work through my relationship with guilt. Because so often as Black women, we feel as though we can't rest or take care of ourselves because we're taking care of everyone else around us. And we have been led to believe that if I'm not doing it, it won't get done. But truth be told, with a job, with a relationship, whatever it may be, we will be replaced. As much as we don't want to admit that, we will be replaced. I've seen coworkers come and go. I have seen relationships end. Eventually people are replaced. And when I thought about that, I said, well, then why am I burning myself out? Why am I killing myself when eventually I could easily be replaced? Now, it won't be the same person, right? But they will replace that void. The other piece, I know that I am in better service to my relationships, to my community, to the work that I do when I'm fully stored. Everything around me has to get the overflow, but I've got to fill my cup up first. And the last piece of this too, when you are in deep community and you are with the people who are really there for you, saying no to them in order to take care of yourself, it won't change the relationship. It might be someone new for them to be introduced to. Trust and believe, when I stopped taking the lead on planning the family vacations, it was a little jarring for everyone. But at the end of the day, we still went on that family vacation. Someone else stepped in and planned it. And to be honest, sometimes people are waiting for us to give them the opportunity to lead and figure out something. And so once I had to step back and think through, what is my relationship with the guilt of me not being the one that finds a solution, that bends over backwards? And then also, why am I so scared of sitting with myself? One of the things, when we're talking about accountability, one of the things that really got me to this book was the fact that I couldn't sit still and I couldn't sit with myself. And I said, who am I running from? And I said, oh, I'm running from myself. And so we have to be able to answer that question, because that's also part of the reason sometimes we don't like to get rest. I had a therapist, a Black woman, who said to me that she wanted me to answer the question of who am I? And I couldn't answer it with my accolades or anything, any professional achievements. And when I tell you, that tore me down, but it got me to a place of really understanding what it means to take care of myself. And again, I have been in better service in relationship to other people because I have prioritized the most important relationship here on earth, which is the one with myself. And so as Black women, we got to move past that guilt, and we got to also let go of that control. And you'll be surprised at how things will, it's not going to be without some bumps, but we'll be surprised with what actually opens up when we do take that time to rest and restore ourselves.
So our final question, after writing this book, what is one belief you hope the readers will question or challenge in their daily lives?
One of the things that I hope people challenge themselves with daily is that their voice or their story isn't important. So often I talk to people, especially people in like my personal life, who minimize their ability to actually enact change. And I tell them it's their stories and their courage that actually allows so many of us to do to run these campaigns, to actually do this work. And so I want people to challenge themselves with the notion that the small acts of disruption that they're taking every single day is not going to be effective, when actually it is. It's the most powerful form of disruption when all of us are committed to it and sharing our stories. And I know that might sound really simple. I'm sure there's like a whole laundry list of issues, policy and legislation that folks want me to talk about. And I do on CNN and MSNBC, but the reality is so often that work seems so enormous, but yet we can move and change society if every person understood that their work is just as important as the president of the United States or that elected official. And the currency that each of us has is our story. And I talk about how important storytelling is. That currency can't be taken away from us. And so our story is what is going to disrupt the world around us. And we just have to believe that it will shift mountains.
So you had a quote at the end of your book. You said, flip the tables. It's proven to be a bomb for many of us, yourself included, needed to navigate this moment, this time. And so we thank you so much for coming to speak to our members. This book is a self-help, part motivation, part inspiration. The book that you said that you needed for yourself, and we definitely needed it during this time. So thank you so much for coming to be with us today. And so I turn it over to Dr. John Thomas III, and he will close us out for tonight.
Hello, everyone. Ms. Johnson, I was in the green room hearing this, and this is the book for our time. And I want to thank you for being here, for taking time out of your day to be with us. I just want to let you know that 21 copies of the book have already been purchased to be sent for you to sign, to give to our leadership. Attorney Battle, Judge Battle, thank you for recommending us to get this book. And again, those of us in this historical moment, this is the book for this time. So those of you all who are watching this, get the book, read the book, and flip the tables. Thank you for being with us today. And we will see you all again on the Christian Recorder Dialogues, but go get that book. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.